Welcome to week 3 of our infamous Meltdowns series. And today I'm going to be honest, church. We have a colossal undertaking ahead of us. You can go ahead and turn with me in your Bible to the book of Job. Or if you're new to faith, the book of Job. It's okay, we have all been there. Job is part of what we call the wisdom literature of the Bible. This also includes the book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And the central question being wrestled with within these books, especially Ecclesiastes, has to do with the problem of evil. Why do we experience suffering? Or put simply, how can you reconcile a God that made a universe out of love with the reality of evil, with everything that you read or see on the news, from famine to children being neglected or abused? There are different crises happening all over the world. There's death itself, even as we gather right now. There's a major conflict happening in Gaza. How does all of this even fit together in this universe supposedly made from love? Well, this question is obviously nothing new. People have wrestled with this since the beginning, and I really hate to break it to you this early on, but we are not going to solve this problem in the next 30 minutes. Instead, the plan today is to share the story and ask good questions. Speaking of questions, our series question, as we do every week, let's read that together. Our question is, how does God respond to us when we fall apart? Now, before we get to the practicality, how God shows Job mercy when Job eventually has this meltdown and he falls apart, there is this oversized elephant in the room, this problem of evil that we can't ignore. So we're also going to discuss that a little bit today. So forgive me, it's kind of a twofold sermon today, but I don't doubt you will be able to keep up. Some facts about Job. Many don't know this, but Job is actually the oldest book in your Bible. No, it is not Genesis. Job is actually one of the oldest stories ever told, and it reads poetic. If you've ever read Shakespeare's Macbeth, or maybe forced to read it in high school, it unfolds in a similar way, like a play. Chapters 1 and 2 of Job, though, they're not poetry. It's actually narrative, and it tells the audience something Job doesn't actually know about. And not to spoil the ending, but Job never knows about it. Before we get into all of that, first, who was Job? The opening lines tell us. Job 1, verse 1, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. So that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. Let's pause. Just so you know, Job, as we can tell, he is well known. He is perhaps famous in his day. He is wealthy. He is well thought of. He's highly respected. He has great faith. He's blameless and upright. Now, that doesn't mean he's without sin. It simply means Job is a man of incredible integrity and high character. The story goes on, verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." Pause right there. For some of us, we don't really know how to accept this story already. But remember, this is an epic, ancient poem. We're not trying to read this literally this morning, but literally today. And the picture we have right now is God is kind of, he's holding court among angels, among the sons of God, and stepping forward is what the Hebrews translate as the Satan, the accuser, the opposer. And Satan approaches, and God asks Satan, where do you come from? Of course, God doesn't have to ask that, but that's what's happening in the story. But notice how Satan answers. It's very interesting. To and fro, which my interpretation is none of your business. To and fro. Verse 8. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house? Pause for a second. That's where we get that Christian cliche. You know, you pray for a hedge of protection. It comes from Job here. And so Satan says, have you not put a hedge around him and his house, and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. So there are two accusations here that Satan is making. The first one is this: Job doesn't really love you, God. He doesn't really love you. He only loves you because you've blessed him so much. The second accusation Satan makes here, he kind of accuses God of being like a corrupt politician. You know, he's more or less saying, you manipulate people with blessings and curses to get what you want. And so it's like Satan is betting against God here. He's saying, I bet if you take away the blessings that you have given Job, he will stop worshiping you. And the wildest thing happens. God actually takes him up on this. Verse 12. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Notice how at first Satan wants God to do this, but God's like, no, I'm not in this business. I'm not in that. I'm not doing that. Instead, he charges Satan to do it. Because then God actually lifts protection off of Job. And now some of us are uncomfortable at that idea. We're kind of left wondering, what? Why? Which is a great question. And again, not to spoil the next 40 chapters for you, but we actually never find out exactly why. That's because the story of Job is actually about something else entirely. And we will get there in just a moment. Now, the story continues. I won't quote it. Let me summarize for you. The story continues, and Satan does what he does. He goes after Job. And a messenger then comes to Job and tells him that the Sabians have killed all the other servants and took his oxen. Another messenger moments later shows up and tells Job how fire has now consumed all the sheep and all the servants over there. A third messenger then comes and tells Job the Chaldeans, they've come, they've taken all of his camels. And then a fourth messenger comes and tells Job, a mighty wind has swept through the area and all of your children are gone. They are all dead. All of Job's property, his wealth, and his children are gone in a very dramatic instant, one after another after another. Go ahead to verse 20. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. Verse 21 right there is one of the most iconic lines in all of the Bible, not just this story, but the entire Bible. We hear that line, often in the face of tragedy, at funerals when someone is in grief. But if I could challenge us a little bit this morning, Job is not right in how he puts this, is he? Because God did not do this. Satan did this. Maybe Job is believing all of this was for some divine purpose, that it will all make sense in the end, or some other awful cliche that we usually say about God's wonderful plan when people are hurting, but that is not true at all. This was the work of Satan. None of this was God's original idea, but Job doesn't know that. Remember, because of the prologue to the story, you, the reader, we know what is really going on. And while Job believes God did this, like Job literally thinks, God killed my kids. God took my wealth away. He took my property. And if that's not enough, Satan then attacks Job's health, and these large boils cover his body, and sitting in the ashes of what was, mourning his losses, Job takes a broken shard of pottery and begins to scrape his skin just to try to get some relief. And if you read on into chapter 2, Job is left only with his wife, whose one awful line in this entire story is how Job should just give up. She says, "Curse God and die." Now, to me, it seems pretty obvious why Satan left her, when you think about it. She's all yours, bro. I won't touch her. She's no good for you, so I'll leave her to you. Now, it's at this point of the story where Job's friends show up. If you go ahead to chapter 2, I think around verse 11, you're introduced to his friends, and they start showing up. They hear about these things that have happened. Go to verse 12. It says, "And when they saw him from a distance," they saw Job from a distance, "they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices, and they wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word, for they saw that his suffering was very great." Church, if only that was it. If only his friends had remained silent and comforting, because this is honestly a great response to grief. When someone suffers loss, you show up, you comfort, and you allow your presence to speak louder than your mouth. But as the prologue to the story concludes, this is where a distinct shift takes place, because chapters 3 through 37 contain the best ancient Near Eastern thought on suffering. And it is personified in these 3 friends as they now begin to debate about what's really going on here. And this is the main part of the book. And I will move quickly here, but we've set all of this up for these 3 questions you will see on the screen. Number 1, is God just? Number 2, does God run the universe on the principle of justice? And number 3, how is Job's suffering explained? Now, remember, when I said today is more about questions than answers, it's true. Again, we will get to the practical series question by the end. How does God show Job mercy? How does he respond when Job has this meltdown? But we're not there yet. And so to this point, we just can't ignore what this story has brought up at this point about suffering and evil, because these are important elements that we must confront for the sake of our faith, or for the sake of the widespread deconstruction of faith happening right now. And for the bulk of this book, Job's friends, they operate under this assumption. And if you look in the seat backs of your chairs right now, church, you will find I have these charts set out for you. And I will try to explain some things on the screen as well, or for those listening online, to make it make sense. But grab that chart. It's going to be really, really helpful. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is that there is a very, very, very big assumption taking place, personified among the friends. And the big assumption is this: if you are wise and good, success and reward will follow. And if you are evil and stupid, disaster and punishment will follow. But that is untrue. And I think many of us struggle with that, even today, that there is somehow this karmic understanding of the universe, that is how God operates. But one of the biggest points in the book of Job is actually to turn that on its head, because God doesn't operate that way. And by the end of chapter 37, you will see for yourself just how short-sighted and futile even the best of human reasoning is. Now, please notice on your chart in hand right now, you will see that we have Job, we have the friends, we have the argument section that then leads over to the implication section, that then leads over to the conclusion, right? And I won't go into the details here. You can see it for yourself. But of course, none of that, the arguments, the implications, the conclusions that are drawn here, none of it is sufficient. And this leads us to Job's infamous meltdown, his demanding of God. So buckle up, people, because here is the heart of the story. Job protests directly to God and essentially asserts that God is disinterested, or that God has somehow fallen asleep, and this leads to divine neglect. Well, God responds to Job, but not directly, because God is more interested in taking Job somewhere than he is explaining every detail of his suffering. In chapter 38, God takes Job on a tour of the cosmos and how his attention is actually on every single detail of the operations of our universe. In fact, God is keenly aware of all kinds of details and perspectives that Job has never considered, nor will he ever consider. And so after the cosmic sightseeing takes place, God then takes Job on a tour of the earth. He asks Job if he's ever provided food for lions, or seen an isolated mountain goat give birth, or if Job understands the feeding patterns of wild donkeys that roam the hills, or ostriches and their strange ways of caring for their young. Maybe Job can have an inspiring conversation with God about Job's knowledge of war horses, or the aerodynamics of an eagle soaring on thermal air currents. As it turns out, Job doesn't know nearly as much as he thinks he does. Even about the world he lives in, should be familiar with, he doesn't know. And so at the end of God's invitations to dialogue, a very humbled Job can only come up with this. Chapter 40, verses 4 and 5, Job says, "Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. I've spoken once, and I will not answer twice, but I will proceed no further." And so at this point, God has made his first point in all of this. Job's accusations of divine neglect or incompetence, they have failed. As it turns out, God is intimately familiar with every molecule and creature in his world and knows more about them than Job could ever comprehend. This is an important moment in the story, because whatever reasons that God has for having allowed Job's suffering, neglect is absolutely not one of them. So after Job confesses to this arrogance, God responds again, and this time he invites Job to actually take up the divine throne and run the universe for a day. God essentially says, "Have at it, Job. Let's let you, enforce your ideas on justice. Let's let you enforce your strict retribution principle. Let's let you take control, Job." In verses 10 through 12, God really presses Job here. He says, "Adorn yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowings of your anger and look on everyone who is proud and abase. him. That means belittle him. Verse 12. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low and tread down the wicked where they stand. So God is saying, because that's kind of poetic language there. It's hard to comprehend maybe. What God is saying, Job, you think I'm unjust? Then you handle the evil of the world, and you judge, and you tear down, and you destroy everyone who is wicked then. Knock yourself out. Job realizes the task is absolutely impossible. And that if he were to apply his own reasons of justice, that there would be no humans left on earth anywhere. So if I could this morning, could I talk to those struggling with faith right now? See, we are Job in this story. You are Job, and you have a high degree, a high knowledge of justice. And you want a God to agree with your sense of right and wrong. And we come to him, and we don't beg, but we actually demand him to answer to us. But like I said at the start, the point of this story is not to give a neat little response to the problem of equal that makes sense to you and makes you feel good about God and faith and suffering and evil and pain. The reality is that we do not know what we are truly asking for, and neither does Job. In theory, rewarding good behavior and punishing bad behavior, it sounds right. But to apply such a principle would create a universe where no human would ever have a chance at trial and error, let alone growth and change. And church, here is the point of Job, right here, write this down. The story of Job is not about understanding suffering and evil. The story of Job is about trusting God. God's response to Job, it does not explain why the righteous suffer, because the cosmos are not designed to prevent righteous people from suffering. Job questioned God's design, and God responded that Job had insufficient knowledge to even do so in the first place. Job questioned God's justice, and God responded that Job needs to trust him, and that he should not arrogantly think that God can be domesticated to conform to Job's feeble perceptions of how the cosmos should be run. God asks for trust, not understanding. And he states that the universe is actually founded not on his justice, but on his wisdom. And with that truth kind of hitting us all in the face, all of a sudden in this story, that God is asking Job to trust, not understand. That he's telling Job, this is about my wisdom, not my justice. When we reach this point of the story, the book concludes with a short epilogue in chapter 42. I'll summarize for you. First, God says that the friends were wrong. And I think we can all see that pretty clearly. Okay, yep, at this point. You know, their ideas about justice, about God's justice, they were too simple. They were not true to the complexity of the world or God's wisdom. And then God says that Job has spoken rightly about him. And this is a little surprising because it can't apply to everything Job said. We just talked about how he protested and how he demanded of God. And so even though Job drew rushed and wrong conclusions, notice God still approves of Job's wrestling with faith and suffering. God approves of how Job approached him honestly with all of his emotion and his whole heart, only wanting to talk to God. God says that the right way to process through these issues is through the struggle of prayer. And the book concludes with Job having his health, family, and wealth restored. But this is so important. This is the point of the book, people. This is not a reward for good behavior. We established that a few minutes ago, right? This isn't about good behavior and here's your reward. This is not a reward for good behavior. But this is actually a generous gift from God instead. It's a generous gift. So how does God respond when Job falls apart? God honors Job's struggle. He honors Job's honesty. And he honors Job's prayer. And in the end, God does not ask that Job would understand, but that Job would trust. And so, as I wrap up here, our application today is pretty simple. I believe in the face of suffering, we tend to do one of two things. You'll see this on the screen. Please write it down. In the face of suffering, we tend to do one of two things. Number one, we simplify God with limited understanding. And number two, we accuse God with limited evidence. So let's reflect on this for a moment. We've walked through Job and we've gone over a lot of things, a lot of uncomfortable truths we have picked up along the way here. But I believe there are some questions for us this morning. How is God asking you to simply trust instead of finding that one right answer? Who in your life do you need to trust God with, instead of trying to understand why faith is just so hard for them? I think we're all praying for people like that. Sons, daughters, friends, parents, where we just wish faith would make sense for them, but they're struggling so much, and we want to know why. Maybe we need to trust God with that this morning. Can you trust in his divine wisdom that there is still more to their story, to your story? There is still more to the world and to what he is doing. We place all faith in Jesus and in his love for us, for humanity. That's all of us. And God sees your righteousness. He sees your wickedness. He also sees your suffering. And he's not far from you. Like our friend Job, we do want answers to our suffering. We want someone to explain it. And there are times when the only honest, healthy, human thing to do is to shake your fist toward the heavens and ask your questions. But even then, true wisdom, the kind we find here with Job, the kind of wisdom that endures and sustains a person, that sort of wisdom knows when to speak and when to be silent. Because your story is not over. The last word has not been spoken. And there may very well be way more going on here than anyone realizes. Church, it is my prayer that you would be released from the need to know why everything happens the way it does. And that as you are released from the need to understand it all, that this freedom would open you up to all sorts of new perspectives and a faith that trusts God's divine wisdom. And speaking of wisdom, may you have the wisdom to know when to say, I spoke once, but now I will say no more.